Yeah, as mentioned by Owain, so this is the first talk. Also, kind of what I normally do a little bit longer than this. So it's a fairly short amount of time we have. So I will try to run through as much as possible, but also be as interactive as possible, because I think that's an important part of this talk. So this is today's agenda. I will do a little introduction. Owain has already done a bit of an introduction about me, but I'll tell a little bit more about myself and the research I'm doing and Helsa, the company I'm running. And then I will talk about the minority stress framework, which perhaps some of what we will talk about this evening is already familiar to you. Hopefully there will be some things that are not familiar or that you haven't thought about before. But I will talk about the minority stress framework a bit, which is a framework that I use primarily in my own research. And then I will jump into kind of the topic of the evening, the cause and the effects of gay shame, or kind of feeling negative emotions because of our sexual identity. Then I will talk about some common coping mechanisms that we might use to kind of address the gay shame that we are dealing with, or not addressing it actually more accurately. And then finally, we'll talk a little bit about what we can do about it. I will try to save some Q&A time for the very end as well, but as mentioned by Owen already, feel free to pop questions as you have them in the chat box, and towards the end, those last few slides, I will make them a bit more interactive, so it's more of a kind of conversation between us than just me talking at you. But for now, I will talk at you for a little while. So Owen has already gone through this. I'm a social scientist or social psychologist researching minority people's mental health and well-being, focus on LGBTQ plus people, but my interest is across all minority and marginalized populations. I am on my final year on my PhD at UCL. I've been doing it part-time, so I'm on year 7, so it's a very long PhD. But there I focus specifically on researching emerging adults, so that's 18 to 29-year-olds in this context, that identify with a plurisexual identity, which is being attracted to more than one gender, so pluri instead of mono. So that's bisexual, pansexual, and queer identifying people in this context. And I do this research because, unfortunately, plurisexual identifying people, as opposed to monosexual identifying people, like, for example, gay and lesbians, and also straight people. But within the LGBTQ community, unfortunately, plurisexual people, so bisexual and other plurisexual identities, have more mental health problems and more well-being issues than their gay and lesbian peers. So my research is to better understand why that is and what we can do to address it. And then I also run Helsa, which essentially is aligned with the research that I'm doing. So it's a company that its mission is to improve mental health and well-being in the LGBTQ plus community through research, training, and support. So we do training workshops on equity, diversity, and inclusion training with specific focus on LGBTQ plus communities. So if you have any, if you work for a company, you think it would be appropriate to have a training from us, then do please get in contact with me about that. So that's a little bit more about myself. I will now jump into a little bit of an introduction into the topic of tonight, which is about gay shame, heterosexual expectations, and how they might impact our lives. So to start off with, just talking about LGBTQ plus people, specifically as this group is for men, so LGBTQ plus men. What percentage do you think of LGBTQ plus people avoid holding hands with their partners in public out of fear of negative reactions? You could just pop your answers in the chat. Is it A, 22%, B, 50%, C, 68%, and D, 91%? This is from one specific survey that was conducted, the National LGBT Survey in the UK, and it was conducted in 2017, and the results were published in 2018. So it is a bit dated now, actually, but it was the largest ever population-wide survey that's been done. So I think it's good data. Owen, what did people think? What was the most popular answer?
I think it's just about marginally more, 68%. We've got mostly 68. There's quite a few Bs, followed by the 50%, and then I think 1 or 2. No, I think most it's B and C. One person thought 91%, Tamas. So tell us, Mark, what is the answer? I want to know.
Good. Well done, people. 68% is the right answer here. And I mean, 50% is not that far off. But according to the National LGBT Survey that was conducted by the Conservative government back in 2016-17, they included over 104,000 participants, or LGBTQ plus people that took part. So it's this a very large scale survey. 68% of people back then avoided holding hands or showing affection with a partner in public out of fear of negative reactions. Another couple of statistics from this survey found that 40% of LGBTQ plus people experienced an incident of verbal harassment or physical abuse every year, and 38% of sexual minority people are not out to anyone at work about their sexual orientation. So these are just three pieces of statistics that really shows that still there are some issues in society relating to acceptance of LGBTQ plus people. And this is essentially why I and many of my colleagues are doing the research that we are doing. All of these kind of amounts to that we as queer people, LGBTQ plus people, queer is perhaps easier to say, so I might use that interchangeably in this talk. We are 2 to 3 times more likely to have common mental health problems, like for example, anxiety and depression, because of the stigma and discrimination that we experience in society still today. As I'm sure you all know, as being part of the community, you live in the society in the UK. I guess most people live in London. We live in an accepting, perhaps in a bit of a bubble in London, but we live in a relatively accepting country compared to many others in the world. However, we have seen significant rises in anti-LGBTQ plus hate crimes for the last few years. This graph here on the right, you can see this is the government has been collecting data on the public's attitudes in general to many different topics, one of them being the attitudes towards same-sex relationships. And they've been doing this and collecting this data since 1983, as you can see on the graph. And at that point, only 17% thought that same-sex relationships are not wrong at all, that they were always acceptable. And that has then increased and improved over the years, as you can see on the graph, up until 2017, where it kind of stopped at 68%, so more or less 2/3 of the population. And it has plateaued ever since. It hasn't really improved or increased since. It dipped in 2018, as you can see, but since it stopped. So it sits there at around 2/3 of the population. Unfortunately, there is no graph available for data that leads up to 2024. But it's just showing how attitudes improve and change dramatically over the years, which relates to what we will talk about further in the talk. Hate crimes have increased, unfortunately, which I'm sure you're all probably aware of as well, not only towards sexual minority people, but towards most minority and marginalized groups in society. As you can see here on the graph as well, since 2012, it has increased greatly to 2021. And on the right-hand side table, you can see sexual orientation on the 3rd row. And you can see there is a steady increase. There was a year-on-year increase of 7% in the far right column, compared to, for example, religion that reduced and race that increased even more. So there are, of course, reasons for us. We are still being discriminated in society, and that contributes to us perhaps feeling bad about our identities or feeling worse about identity, which is what gay shame relates to, which we will talk more about. But it's just to give you a little bit of a background of what it looks like today in the LGBTQ plus community in terms of mental health outcomes, in terms of fears or worries or concerns we still have about being open about our sexualities, and also hate crimes and attitude statistics. Yes, Owen.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you a little question. I might be misinterpreting the graphs, but why would you say there is an increase in hate crimes based on sexual orientation if at the same time there is an increase from the previous slide in acceptance?
Yeah, it's an interesting one, actually. I think good question. A reason for hate crimes increasing across the board, it's multifaceted. So it's also in a way positive, because it has to do with people stepping forward and actually reporting hate crime more, and especially when it comes to sexual minority people. In the past, when not that many years ago, when it was actually illegal to have same-sex relationships. Obviously, a lot of gay men back then had quite a dubious relationship with the police. They didn't trust the police, a bit like black people in the US and the UK, you didn't trust the police to protect you and be there for you. So many people were hesitant of stepping forward and actually report if a hate crime happened. And also if attitudes were really poor, then you didn't want to have even more hate crimes towards you. So because attitudes have improved, people are more likely to step forward and actually report hate crimes. So that in a sense is a positive thing, seeing these numbers going up. There's also the addition of online hate crimes that have also made this number increase even more. So there is more ways and more reasons for people to step forward and report hate crimes. That definitely contributes to the reason why we see it as we see it. So, does that answer your question? Yeah. All right. Moving on then to the minority stress framework. So this is a framework that was coined by a professor in the US, in California, called Ilan Meyer, back in 2003. He's a good colleague to my supervisor, and I've also worked with him on a couple of projects. So he coined it back in 2003, primarily then to explain why sexual minority people had more mental health problems than the general population. And the minority stress framework, then, it focuses on the stresses that we experience as sexual minority people because of our sexual minority identity. So these are additional stresses to all the stresses that everyone experiences in their everyday life. So we all experience stress, right, related to family problems, relationships, work stress, and so forth. All of us have those experiences. Minority stress is the additional stress that we experience because of our minority identity. So it was developed to explain this disparity between sexual minority people and general population, but it has since been expanded to explain disparities between any minority group really and the general population. So now it's a framework that is very widely used. We used it in a paper recently to explain kind of mental health outcomes with Brexit, after Brexit, and people from EU countries living in the UK being a minority group, and how they dealt with the aftermath of Brexit. So the minority stress framework is made up of 5 different stressors. 2 of them are external and 3 of them are internal. And I will run through them now one by one and give some examples. The first one is the most obvious one. So it's prejudice events or hate crimes or instances of discrimination that we experience. Most of us have probably had some form of prejudice event happen to us throughout our lives, especially if we're mine and Owen's age, which I assume quite a few people probably are in this. I'm 42, so I've had some years to have had experience happen to me. So this is discrimination or biased treatment that happens. They are one-off events, hopefully not something that happens to you on a daily basis, at least not from a Western kind of context. So living in the UK, it hopefully doesn't happen to that many people on a daily basis. If you live in a different country, of course, the situation is completely different. And perhaps I should also give that as a little caveat. This talk is obviously from a perspective of a Western world, European perspective, in countries where we are legally protected and we have rights. So obviously it's a completely different situation if you're in a Middle Eastern country or in many African countries. So that understood, which I'm sure we understand. So prejudice events is one external minority stress factor that can have a negative impact on you, which I'm sure is quite obvious. The second external minority stress factor is microaggressions. Most of you are probably familiar with these as well, but perhaps not what impact they actually can have on people. So microaggressions are small, chronic, everyday aggressions. It could, for example, be like a stare of disgust as you walk past someone in the street, or it could be your work colleague maybe not inviting you for lunch, but everyone else that sits around your work desk, for example. And in isolation, one microaggression is probably okay for people to deal with, maybe even a few. But if you have these happening to you on a daily basis, over and over, year after year, then they will chip away on your self-esteem, and they will chip away on your sense of self or how you see yourself. It's almost inevitable. And microaggressions, I think, can be extra hard on people that can perhaps not kind of conceal or hide their sexual identity. When I talk about this from an EDI perspective and talk about the whole LGBTQ plus community, we often talk about gender minority people. Some, of course, will be able to conceal that they are trans or non-binary. Others might not be able to, and for them, microaggressions can be really impactful because they might happen, and there is nothing you can do about it. You can't hide or you conceal yourself. So microaggressions, when they happen a lot, they will become a problem for most people. Those are the two external minority stress factors, microaggressions and prejudice events. We will now move on to talk about the internal ones, and the ones that are more relating to the kind of idea of gay shame. The first one is internalized stigma, or internalized homophobia, or internalized biphobia, or panphobia, depending on what sexual identity you have or use. So internalized stigma is essentially to hold negative views and feelings of shame associated to your minority identity. And as you will find out, the internal minority stress factors, they tend to stem from the external minority stress factors. So it is, if you've heard over and over again that being gay is disgusting or wrong or a sin or whatever it might be that your, for example, religious family told you when you grew up, then perhaps you start internalizing it and actually start believing that that is actually true. And so you start believing these negative views and what you have been told by perhaps friends, people, peers at school or at work about yourself. And internalized stigma is very much associated with this idea of having shame around our sexual identity and who we are. The next one is concealment of identity. And this can happen in two different ways. So the obvious way is not being out about your sexual minority identity, so concealing that you're gay. Perhaps you're concealing it to everyone, yourself included, and that can be really taxing, obviously, on your mental health to have to deal with and to suppress feelings and emotions and having to live an untrue and unauthentic life. It might also be that you are open to yourself and perhaps you have a partner, but you're concealing your identity at work or to your family members and so forth. And then that creates also tensions because you have to make sure that you know when you're telling a story about your apparently seemingly straight life and when you can be open about how you actually are and your sexuality. So concealment of identity can be in different ways. It can be when you choose to reveal it to other people, depending on the context, and it can also be concealing it and not showing it in a specific social context. So I talked about just before about microaggressions, that for some people that are not unable to conceal their identity, perhaps gender identity is a better example, but also sexual identity in some ways. If your gender expression is perhaps not very heteronormative, for being a man, for example, then perhaps it's quite obvious to other people that you're gay and you can't conceal your identity. That makes you more vulnerable for external minority stress, for prejudice events, and for microaggressions to happen, as opposed to if you perhaps can come across as a straight person if you try to, then you can conceal your identity when you are in situations that might be potentially, that you conceive as potentially harmful. Give it another example, walking down the street holding your partner's hand. I can, for example, and I'm sure many of us do, scanning our environments for potential dangers. So, for example, I might hold my partner's hand, we're walking down the street, walking home from the pub, and up the road, I see a group of men standing around being drunk and loud. And perhaps I let go of my partner's hand and we just walk past this group of men in a kind of a normal fashion without showing any affection towards each other. That would be an example of concealing your identity in a context-specific environment to avoid external minority stress. And I think concealing our identity in this instance, I think most of us have done at some point and perhaps still do on a regular basis. I mean, I know myself, I've been out since I was 14 years old and I work in this industry, and I think I'm generally a very proud gay man. But even I kind of scan my environments. It's kind of an automatic thing of that I've gotten used to since I was young, to scan my environment for potential dangers before I kind of hold my partner's hand or kiss him goodbye and so forth. So concealment of identity is the fourth and the second internal minority stress factor. Yes, Owain.
Mark, sorry to jump in again, but could you perhaps give a definition of heteronormative to anyone out there who might struggle with the term?
Yeah, of course. So heteronormative is just what the general population and society expect us to behave and believe. So heteronormative, and in this context when it comes to sexuality and gender identity, heteronormative is how we are expected as a society to behave in a heterosexual way, because the vast majority of the population is heterosexual, and we have up until recently lived in a very, very heteronormative society where it was illegal in the UK and in most countries to be anything else than heterosexual. Therefore, our society is heteronormative with an expectation. It also stems from religion and stems from many different things. Expectation of a man and a woman living together, and they are having a family together, and they're living in this heteronormative construct where a man and a woman have children, and that's a heteronormative family, and a man is expected to behave in a certain masculine way. Their gender expression is expected to be in a certain masculine way, which changes across culture and across time, but a woman is expected to behave in a certain feminine way, which also changes across culture and time, but that's for another conversation. But heteronormative is essentially the idea and the expectation that we are all heterosexual and that we all follow these stereotypical gender roles and gender expressions.
Thank you.
All right. Moving on to the final and fifth minority stress factor, which is expectations of rejections. So this is assuming that people will hold negative views or react negatively because of one's minority identity. And this is, again, very much related to the idea of gay shame. Gay shame is a common expression that has been used. It's been used in a few different books. It uses the word gay, which me and Owen have talked about, that I like to be more inclusive when we talk about sexual minority men in this context. Not everyone identifies gay, but it's the same idea. So sexual minority shame, sexual minority identity shame, essentially, is what it refers to. So it's feeling shame, feeling negative feelings around you, and expecting the world, society, other people around you, your colleagues, perhaps your family members, to also have negative opinions and views about you because of your, again, sexual minority identity in this case. So we can take another example. For example, you worked in a workplace where you experienced some homophobia as a gay man, and you had some colleagues that were quite homophobic, and that really was one of the contributing factors to you actually going out, finding another job, eventually doing that. So you quit your job, and you're excited about the first day on your new job. However, you're feeling also super anxious and nervous because you're somewhat expecting that you walk into this new office and you will experience something similar. You will experience, again, that people will have negative views about you, and that causes you perhaps a lot of anxiety the day before or several days before starting your new job, even though your new workplace and your new colleagues might be super accepting of you as a gay man. So it's the internal minority stress factors. What makes them really powerful is that they are internal, they sit within you, so they are not directly depending on what happens externally. You can have all these expectations of rejection. They can cause a lot of anxiety and stress and depression, or whatever it might be, even though you might actually live in an environment that is not homophobic. You might work in a workplace that is not homophobic, but you have experienced so much external minority stress in the past that you have now just come to expect it, regardless of if it's there or not. Those are the 5 minority stress factors, and I'm happy to answer more questions about at the end if anyone has any. Let's then move on to gay shame and the topic of this talk. So the cause of gay shame, then, that kind of it is connected with minority stress, right? It's the experiences that we had. Most of us, obviously, it varies, but gay shame is normally caused by experiences that we had in our informative years. So when we were children, adolescents, into young adulthood or emerging adulthood, but perhaps most prominently in our childhood and adolescent years. So the cause of gay shame will be minority stress factors that we experienced, negative comments that we heard about being gay, and rejection, hate, and prejudices. So it might be things we heard when we weren't even clear about our own sexual identity, and then a bunch of things that we experienced, heard, and then experienced when we came to terms with our sexual identity. And for each of these 4 slides, there are some obvious causes of gay shame, right? And they will always be at the top, and then there's some less obvious, perhaps, that I would then go into. So the most obvious is obviously having rejection, perhaps from your family when you came to terms with your sexuality, having experienced hate, discrimination, bullying at school, and prejudice at school and in your home environment, obviously causes trauma and causes distress. So those are the obvious reasons for it. Furthermore, family relationship breakdowns, it's not necessarily that your parents threw you out of the house that happened, but it might be a breakdown in an understanding and a love and the close relationship that you perhaps had with, for example, your mother before coming out, and then her having to accept that, even though it goes, for example, against her religious beliefs or against her wider understanding, that can still cause kind of family relationship breakdowns that can be very painful on people. Other causes, essentially the idea of not fitting in, of feeling that you are different from everyone else, that you don't fit into this heteronormative society that we live in and that we are expected. Most of us, especially people of our generation, when we were raised and when we were children, we were expected to grow up as being straight and expected to fit into these specific molds that were created for boys and girls and men and women. And for many people, when you realize that you didn't fit into those buckets that were created for you, that causes self-esteem issues and causes of potential shame around your sexuality. And that sits together also with coming out. And I know that it's a different time today, and it's also really important to talk about generational differences in this context, which I will come on to a little bit more. But coming out for many people of my generation before me for sure, and I think to a certain extent the generation after as well, or the generations after, you might say, coming out is often associated with some form of trauma. It's almost an expectation that someone will have a negative reaction to it. If it's not your parents, if your parents accepts you, then we are grateful that they accepted us, but there will definitely be some friends that have some negative comments or have not accepting. So the idea that coming out is always associated with some form of trauma, some kind of negative experience, I think has for many people contributed also to this sense of gay shame that some people have. And then we have the unspoken and spoken heteronormative expectations. So I already talked into them with Owen in regards to what kind of our parents and our peers and our society expects us to behave like, expects us to value, expects us to do with our life. And for many of us, a lack of support and education around sexual minority identities and what it meant to be gay were definitely lacking in the UK, in Sweden, where I'm from, and in many other countries. I know it's better today, but I know that the conservatives are also backtracking on that, but it's a lot better today than when, for example, I grew up. But for many of us, that still has an impact on us today. Looking at the time, are there any other causes that anyone else would like to bring up that I haven't covered in terms of what could contribute to gay shame? I can otherwise put it in the chat. Because,
Mark, would you consider gay shame from within the gay community? You know how some people feel they don't belong within the community. We obviously have examples that we've shared. People who come out later in life think, okay, this is my chance, and then okay, they don't. Gay shame come from within, rather, because all of it is heteronormative, but there's a lot that's being spoken about with the Adonis thing, the XXL thing, of the community almost turning in on itself.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I will come on to it a little bit. I will talk a little bit about a concept that comes on a couple of slides. I will talk a little bit about that then. It's slightly different than the shame that you've carried with you since your childhood or adolescence years, and that have to a certain extent perhaps formed your identity and formed the way that you see yourself and your role in society. It's related, but it's slightly different. But I'll come on to it. I will also come on to this slide if we have time at the end. This is kind of looking at, it's something I put together myself at the beginning of my PhD, and it's looking at different micro-generations because acceptance and laws and attitudes have changed so rapidly in the Western society towards LGBTQ plus people. We can kind of talk about micro-generations of gay people or queer people growing up. But I can come back to this one if we have time at the end. Instead, we move on to the effects of gay shame then. So they are obvious, some of them, and perhaps some of them less so. But the obvious one is obviously it will leave us with unresolved trauma. Having shame happening, being shamed at the having this discrimination, these issues happening when we are young, they cause unresolved trauma that can cause low self-esteem, relationship problems, and eventually mental health problems, which I covered at the very start, talking about how we as a community as a whole are 2 to 3 times more likely to have mental health problems because of discrimination and shame. Some common coping mechanisms then. So we might have experienced all of these negative experiences when we were young, and eventually we grow up and we come out and we're openly gay. And some of this trauma that we went through, a lot of us deal with it, and a lot of us can deal with it ourselves. Of course, I do not mean that all of us have to go to therapy and deal with unresolved trauma in our childhood. Some of us didn't have any of that at all, for sure, but many of us did. So some of us deal with it. We can deal with it ourselves, with our friends, talking through it and get through it ourselves. Some of us go to therapy and get help there. And some of us do not deal with it in that sense, but use coping mechanisms to cope with it rather. And these 4 examples of coping mechanisms, they are not necessarily negative or positive. They can be used in a positive way, and they can be used in negative ways. So the first one, the most obvious perhaps, is repression. Essentially, push away, don't think about it, don't deal with it. Many of us have done that by simply moving away from the kind of the origin of the trauma. So many of it, myself included, for example, I moved from a small town in Sweden to now live in London. And many of us do that, not just to move away from trauma, but also to find like-minded, to be with other gay people. That's why we tend to move into big cities as well. But repression, one way to repress is to simply move away from it and ignore it and don't talk about it. But obviously repression in other ways is essentially repressing thoughts about what happened and experiences that you have and not deal with it at all. For some people that might work to a certain extent, but for some people could probably do with actually addressing and dealing with those issues. The second one is escapism. Again, it can be a positive coping mechanism to escape in a way from not having to deal with certain negative feelings or experience that you have. But escapism can also go too far, and it can end up in, for an escapism example might be going out partying excessively and taking drugs and alcohol and participating in dangerous sexual environments and so forth, and kind of leads into Ben Kay's talk in a couple of weeks' time, where many sexual minority men perhaps use escapism and kind of addictive behaviors or unhealthy behaviors in a way of not dealing with childhood trauma and shame associated with our sexuality. Then we have the next, confirmation bubbles, confirmation bias bubbles, which I think is a really interesting one to think about. And when we have a certain view about ourselves, for example, that we think less of ourselves because of our sexual identity, we don't perhaps think that we deserve to be in a happy and flourishing relationship, because that's just for men and women together, because that's the heteronormative norm that we were told by parents. Perhaps our parents told us that you will never be happy because you will never find a good working relationship because you're gay, and gays don't have working relationships. So you might have started to internalize that, and so an internalized stigma and a shame associated with your identity. And then you go out and you find like-minded people. You create little confirmation bias bubbles where you actually are attracted to other people that think or feel like you. And to a certain extent, people that don't think or feel like you might not be attracted to you because of those traits. So we create little confirmation bias bubbles. We do this in many different contexts in our lives, but these confirmation bias bubbles, I think, can often be negative, because they insert the idea that the lesser belief that you have in yourself, or that you don't deserve better and you deserve the negative things in your life, being kind of reinforced by these confirmation bias bubbles and relationships that you strike up with other people that maybe have had similar experiences in their life. The last one here is overcompensation. This can be a positive thing. The whole idea of gay men working really hard and having careers to compensate for the fact that we we disappointed our parents by not having children and turning out gay. There is some truth in that. There is some research evidence to support that gay men or sexual minority men work very hard in their careers, or we work very hard on our bodies. We kind of overcompensate in other areas to make up for the perceived failings of our sexual minority identity. And there comes in the inter-gay community stress that relates back to a bit of what you were talking about, Sid. You can see if we have time. I want to run through my last slides before, and then we can see what we have time to talk about for the last kind of 10, 15 minutes. But as I thought, there was quite a lot of information to go through in a relatively short amount of time. But we can come back to this one. Inter-gay community stress, I think, is a really interesting theoretical framework that I kind of resonate with a lot. But let's go to the last slide before that. So what can we do about it? If we, and obviously I want to make it clear, I do not mean that we are all ashamed of our sexualities in no way. I am a very proud, for example, I'm a very proud queer or gay man, and I'm not ashamed of my sexuality, but I have elements of shame associated still with my sexuality that stems from experiences that I had as a child and an adolescent. I work hard on kind of addressing them, identifying them, addressing them, and removing them. So I hope this is clear in the talk. That I do not talk about that we are all ashamed of our sexualities and we wish we weren't gay. It's just elements of shame that many of us carry with us, and that do prevent us in many ways from living our best gay lives or getting the most out of life, because we essentially kind of ruin it for ourselves by the internal minority stress that we might experience. So what can we do about it? If we feel that we have some shame associated with our sexuality and it's holding us back a bit and it's not allowing us to live our best lives, what can we do? Well, the most obvious is to obviously address the trauma that we might have. And the most obvious way of doing that is to deal with it, to talk to somebody about that. If that might be a therapist, that might be friends, that might be a support group, whatever it is. That's the most obvious. And if you are clear about what your traumas and issues around your sexuality are. If it's if it's more subtle than that, then perhaps less of an action is needed. Another good idea is to confront our own prejudice and bias towards other gay, queer men, sexual minority men. I think often when we have prejudice and ideas, and going back again to what you talked about, Sid, when we have negative ideas about other people within the community, how they act, behave, and we think something is wrong, it often is a bit of a reflection of issues we have around our own sexuality, especially within our own community. So a good idea is to identify what are the real triggers, what triggers you with other people in the community, their behavior, the way they, and analyze and understand, why does that trigger you? Why is that a problem? And perhaps that you will learn something about your own, how you view yourself within that. Next one I would advise people to try to do is to break out of these confirmation bias bubbles. Don't just assume that the risk with confirmation bias bubbles is that we start believing that the whole world looks like this. So we start believing that all gay men are like this. My group of friends are like this. None of them have working relationships. They don't believe in monogamy, or they all take drugs, and that's all that all gay men do because my friends are doing that. So thinking that just because your social context does something, the whole gay community and all gay men behaves like that is, I think, is not correct. It's not accurate, and it's not very useful in many ways. So breaking out of those confirmation bubbles, maybe reaching out and making friends that have different interests or different ways, is a good idea to get out of that as well. Then identify heteronormative expectations in our lives. We all have them. Some expectations are also fine to have. Some gay men want to have children. Me and my husband want to have children, for example. So that's a heteronormative expectation. That is fine. But other heteronormative expectations, perhaps in the way that you behave, your gender expression, are perhaps not useful for you. So identify these expectations that you have and that you can understand it's just because of what society expects from you, not because of something that you actually want to do or behave. And then finally, take pride in our sexuality in all social contexts. Obviously, keep yourself safe. Don't take any risks that you don't want to take. I'm not saying you have to hold hand with your partner going through some dodgy, and I don't know where, but don't take unnecessary risks, but try to take pride in your sexuality in all social contexts. And I think also you'll help yourself in a way, but you will also help other people in the community. To go back to that statistic about almost 40% of people not open about their sexuality in the workplace, for example. Well, if people started being more open in the workplace about their sexuality, then it would be easier for everyone. So taking pride in your sexuality, being open in whatever ways you can, showing affection with your partner when you can, I think is also a really good way of kind of boosting your own self-esteem and view about your identity as a gay or queer man. I've blubbered on for a long time without having any chance for anyone to kind of jump in, but we have 10 minutes left now, so I managed to get through my slides. So we have 10 minutes left now. So I would like to kind of ask you, if you have specific questions, of course, but otherwise, if there are other things in these last 4 slides, kind of what is causing gay shame, coping mechanisms, are there any other coping mechanisms that you have experienced yourself, where you've seen your friends use, and are there any other advice from the audience? What do you think we can do to kind of address and reduce the potential shame that we might have relating to our sexual identities?
Mark, can I ask you to unshare your screen as well? And
Yes.
I just wanted to start by saying thank you so much. That was brilliant. I feel like every single point on every single slide resonated with me. And I'm sure many people will feel the same way. Another thing I will say, one thing you can do about it that certainly helped me from perhaps escaping slightly my own confirmation bias bubble in the last year is Big Gay Out. The events are full of all kinds of people from all different backgrounds, and many of them I probably would never have met otherwise. So there's one way you can help. And of course, I'm going to plug the events. Because he said,
I think that's a really good idea. I think this is one of the best ideas with Big Gay Out, is that you actually meet people that you otherwise wouldn't necessarily perhaps meet, that aren't like in your direct circles. I think it's a really valuable thing that we do.
Thank you. No, and honestly, thank you. That was such a brilliant talk. I feel like I could ask you, even though we've known each other for so long, I feel like I've now got about 25 questions that I want to ask you personally. I'm going to not ask a first question. So if anybody does have a question, please, with that question, Dickie?
It's kind of a question. I guess it's just an add-on to what you've just said about community services that are there. So if you're not coping, if there's something you're not coping with, you mentioned a lot about mental health. That's that I'm in. So there are crisis services in all boroughs of London, LGBT services as well, available throughout London as well. So there are services there to help. So I think in terms of a crisis, contact local crisis lines, mental health crisis lines. Each trust has one. And failing that, go to A&E, come and see us in A&E and talk it through. It's better that you come and see someone in a crisis for however long it takes, and you go home at night, than the worst that can happen, which we all know kind of down that road. So I just wanted to kind of tag that on, because I think it's really important.
It's a really good point, and we should definitely make sure that we have that at the end of a talk like this going forward. I normally send through like a resources and references list afterwards, if anyone is interested, and also kind of recommendations of books that you might want to read or films that you might want to see on this topic, which I can send through, because we give them normally in kind of work environments, EDI environments. I don't, but it's a good point, Dickie. So we'll make sure that we will add that to it, to the talk at the end.
Yeah, thank you.
Or you have to come along every time and do it verbally yourself.
Yeah, maybe we can have another talk. Is that another talk possibly in the future?
Yeah.
We will be, by the way, posting this on the members section of the app on the content page. So I will post alongside that resources. I think there might be a space where I can put some resources. So if you do send some over to me, Mark or Dickie, I can post those. If nobody else wants to jump in with a question, I would like to ask a question. It might be quite specific. I don't know. It might even be another talk in itself. I'm hoping Mark might do another talk this year on one of his many.
Yeah, of course.
So many talks I know Mark could give himself, and he's a great speaker. How do you find? Do you know anything about, I should ask, how the effect of internalized stigmas, internalized homophobia, for example, might affect us sexually or in other parts of our lives more specifically?
Yeah, it's not my specific expertise as in research, but I mean, from the most in the most obvious ways that I guess most of us are aware of, it does, right? In terms of our sexual roles, is that what you mean, or because our sexual roles, I think, are very much linked back to heteronormative expectations and gender roles and who is the man and who is the woman, and it goes back to kind of basics, but still, I think it's relevant still today in terms of of heteronormative expectations and it being conceived as being in some contexts, I do not agree with this at all, but in some contexts that if you're a top, then you're more the man, and if you're a bottom, then more you're a woman. And there's still bottom shaming going on, right? Which goes back to heteronormativity and internalized stigma without a doubt. So I think definitely in terms of gender role and gender expectations, gender expression expectations, it has an effect in our sexualities. But I think, do you think in other ways as well? I mean, it has in other ways as well, in terms of how we have sex, in terms of how we used to have sex when we weren't legally allowed to, where we were having sex in public places, in toilets or in parks and so forth. So I think the way that we have sex, it's definitely influenced by our history and where we were allowed and we could have sex in the past. Ben, do you want to jump in?
Yes, Ben. Can you unmute yourself? Yeah.
Yeah, hi. I just wanted to say thank you very much, really. It was kind of on that point, I saw. I just wanted to say,
sorry.
yeah, I just wanted to say thank you. I don't want to take you away from what you're talking about. You want to finish that, Mark?
Yeah, sorry. I thought you were jumping in for that.
No,
Okay.
no.
I'll continue with it. Yeah, so I guess from a different point of view, and we've had conversations about it, you and I think, or I've had it with most friends, in regards to as well how we have sex and kind of the risks involved of having sex. I think we've had discussions about this with some people in this group, the risk taking and in having sex that perhaps stems to some extent back to when it was a risk having sex in public places and we could get arrested and so forth. And I think that even though many of us, especially younger queer guys now, did not live in those days, but the culture of gays and the culture of how we have sex, I think that there's still an influence of that, I'm sure.
I think one of the reasons why I mentioned that specifically was to try to give people an example where we often some people might simultaneously have those sorts of beliefs in sexual roles, for example, but not believe that they have any internalized homophobia. You know, if you ask them, you know, do you believe that you have any? It's quite a not many people are aware of it. It's quite covert a lot of the time.
Yeah, here I think another good way of asking people whether they have any internalized kind of or shame associated or negative connotations associated with homosexuality or gay sexual minority people is, if you had a child, would you be equally happy with that child being gay or lesbian? I think it's an even better question for straight people that states that they have no issues at all with gay people and are completely accepting. But then if you ask them, well, if you had a child, would you be equally happy if that child turned out straight or gay? And then you will all of a sudden get quite a lot of people that would say, no, I prefer them to be straight, and because their lives would be easier that way, which I think is a bit of a bullshit.
Thank you.
Just a quick one from you. Is there any so I know your study is around people in that sort of foundational stage of their life, but is there any indication, we broke it down by generation, sort of boomers, X, millennials, and Z, is there any indication things are getting better by generation?
Yeah.
Do boomers carry more shame than us millennials, for example?
So the problem is, I mean, Owen has talked a little bit about it just before the talk, actually. The problem, unfortunately, is that because, again, UK context or European context, things are getting better, right? We are being more accepted. There is more out actors, singers, and so forth. There's more representation in the media and so forth. So all of those things are positive. And also, there are many more young people coming out, as I'm sure you also know, but, you know, our generation was maybe 3% LGBTQ+. The latest generation is as much as up to 20% that identify within the LGBTQ+ community. Most of them plurisexual, most bisexual. That's by far the biggest. Unfortunately, that group still have a lot of mental health problems. They seem to be associated with slightly different things than they were in our generation, perhaps. So they are more related to, because younger queer people have have slightly different identities, then there are generational differences in how we identify and how we express our sexuality, so and gender identity. And I think a lot of the mental health problems you see amongst younger queer people these days are more associated with gender identity and gender expression. So often it's not so much maybe being attracted to another person of the same gender or sex as you, but it's the way that your gender expression plays out. And it's not necessarily just about being trans or non-binary, but it's just being gender non-conformative. And those issues being much more at the forefront and causing mental health problems than with older generations.
I'd like to just jump in and talk about gay shame. I don't live in a major city. Some of you know, some of you don't know. Leaving London and that bubble, that gay bubble that I existed in for so many years, and stepping away from that was kind of revolutionary in terms of like understanding there is a world outside of the gay scene, and it's amazing.
Yeah.
For those people, it really, believe it or not, but for those people that are teetering on the edge of that and wondering how they can feel a part of or feel accepted, there is a world apart from that gay scene that isn't always as friendly as it appears. So we're talking about gay shame. Outside of a major city, I'm seeing I work with lots of GBMSM people, gay, bi, men who have sex with men. More about that another time next week. There's lots of shame in the community, the GBMSM community, around the sex that they're having, how they identify when or not they're either under the influence. And it isn't just a queer, I love that we've identified minority stress. I think it's game changing in terms of people seeking support that they need and identifying with things that they can't quite put their finger on. But now that we're identifying it, how do we support people moving forward therapeutically? When people are using substances and they are kind of, doing all they can to kind of make themselves feel better. But the shame really spills out into all areas of our community and the wider communities, in fact. And I think it's really worth talking about. I did a talk today, actually. I was talking about adverse childhood experiences. And some people that don't know what they are, they're experiences that we suffer in childhood that could result in trauma later on in life. Unfortunately, minority stresses are not on those ACE charters. And I would love them to be on those ACE charters, because as queer people, identify as being from the LGBTQ plus community, for those that don't like the word queer, I happen to like it. It's really important to understand. It really is important to understand that the minority stress isn't actually factored in. And when we begin to understand, I feel this way because of this happened to me, people can begin to, put all the pieces together. I think it's great that you're doing this work, Marc, and reaching out to heteronormative society and explaining that. And just want to thank you for this platform, Mo, and I think it's amazing. So well done, Marc. It's lovely to hear you.
Thank you. That's a perfect kind of segue over to Ben, who will do the talk in 2 weeks' time, and we'll cover much more about when escapism goes wrong and how that happens. So great. Yeah, it's 2 minutes past 8, Owen. So I don't know if we.
Yeah, no, I think that's probably it for questions. Unless Shahid, do you have anything? Because you turned your video, and it's lovely to see your face. Or were you just joining us to say hello? Okay.
No, I've come from the gym. I've come home.
Okay.
So I'm now at home.
Okay, fine. It's nice to see your face. Well, Marc, thank you so much once again. We don't want these talks to run over and get a reputation to be spilling over into like 9:30 and 10s and people not wanting to do them. So we are going to stop there. So you do have an evening. Thank you everyone for joining us. It has been recorded. It will be uploaded. So if you do have friends or other people you know who might like to see this talk or knew about it but couldn't make it and didn't know if it was going to be posted, please tell them it is going to be posted. I'll post that immediately. It should be available within 24 hours. Thank you all for being here for our first ever Big Gay Talk. I feel it was a big success. Thank you, Marc. And please join us again for our next talk in 2 weeks' time with the wonderful Benjamin Kay, who's up. Well, for me, he's there. He might be somewhere else for the rest of you. He's a great speaker and he is very knowledgeable about the subject. So I'm very excited about that talk too. On the 31st, you can register again via the app for that. And see you all again soon. Have a lovely rest of your, is it Tuesday? Yes. Okay, bye.
Have a lovely evening.
Thank you. Good night.
Ciao, ciao.